They came from diverse backgrounds. Some spoke English, others French. Some had spent their entire lives in Louisiana, while others hailed from West African warrior nations. About the only thing they had in common was that they had been subjected to the atrocity of American slavery, and that they were willing to risk their lives to obtain freedom at the point of a sword. In January 1811, 500 slaves of the German coast, the fertile agricultural region just upriver from New Orleans, rose in active rebellion against their masters. This was not the chaotic uprising of an angry mob. It was a highly organized, meticulously premeditated challenge to the slave owner class. Its leaders had a clear objective: to capture the city of New Orleans and establish a free black republic on the banks of the Mississippi. This is the story of the largest slave revolt in American history, the German Coast Uprising of 1811. Nearly 8 years after the Louisiana Purchase, New Orleans was a city of political intrigue. The governor of the Orleans Territory, a stubborn Virginian named William Claiborne, sought constantly to increase American power and influence in the region, at the expense of the proud French planters whose families had been in Louisiana for generations. The Creoles of New Orleans thought the American newcomers were boorish, rustic, and unrefined. The Americans thought that the Creoles were vain, effeminate, and idolatrous. The two sides refused to even live together, and many Americans settled in the suburb of Faubourg St. Mary, just upriver of the Vieux Carré. The Americans called the Creole side of Canal Street the French Quarter, and the name stuck. As the two factions squabbled for supremacy in the city, a very different political drama was unfolding on the German coast. Preoccupied with preparing for a raucous carnival celebration, the whites of this region did not notice their slaves secretly meeting with slaves from other plantations. They did not notice the groups of men speaking in hushed voices here at Congo Square during Sunday dances. And in their arrogance, they did not comprehend that they were about to be outmaneuvered by people that they saw as little more than beasts of burden. The architect of this conspiracy was a man named Charles Deslondes. The son of a white father and black mother, Deslondes worked as a slave driver on the Woodland Plantation. He planned work schedules, meted out punishments to idle or unruly slaves, and reported directly to Manuel Andry, the master of the Woodland Plantation. To everyone who knew him, he was Andry's obsequious right-hand man, his loyal lapdog, a cruel overseer given preferential treatment simply because of the lightness of his skin. It was an act. Deslondes despised the slave owner class. And in the autumn months of 1810, two other men got to know the real Charles Deslondes. Their names were Cook and Comandant, and they were recent arrivals from West Africa, more specifically the Akan Kingdom. These were big, scary guys, ritualistic scars on their faces, and they probably had military experience. Charles Deslondes told them all about how 20 years earlier, the slaves of Haiti had risen up and slaughtered their masters, and successfully established an independent black state. These revolutionary whispers must have been like music to Cook and Comandant's ears. This triumvirate, these three men, represented a confluence of West African military strategy and French Creole political cunning. Slowly, carefully, these three men set about fermenting rebellion. During the first week of January, 1811, a fearsome rainstorm descended upon South Louisiana. The downpour lasted for days, and soon the roads were half a leg deep in mud. No field work could be accomplished in the driving, pounding rain. The slaves of the German coast were idle, and those involved in Deslondes' conspiracy must have been restless. Finally, word came, through furtive whispers on plantations and at the Congo Square dances. On January 8th, 2 days after Twelfth Night, the beginning of Carnival, the fight for freedom would begin. The timing was no accident. Governor Claiborne had sent most of the troops at his disposal to Baton Rouge to secure the American annexation of Spanish West Florida. New Orleans was practically defenseless. On the night of the 8th, Deslondes and 25 slaves crept into the big house of the Woodland Plantation, armed with axes and cane knives. Manuel Andry woke to see Deslondes standing over his bed with murder in his eyes. He reacted quickly, launching himself up and breaking through his attackers as they lashed out with their blades. Andry's son, Gilbert, wasn't quite so lucky. Another group of slaves surrounded him and hacked him to pieces.
Andry fled the woodland plantation and made for the river. Despite his injuries, he boarded a rickety canoe and paddled all the way across to the west bank of the Mississippi. Once there, he burst into the home of a plantation owner named Charles Perret and told him the catastrophic news. His slaves were revolting.
Meanwhile, the rebels raided the basement of Andry's house for rifles and militia uniforms. It would not be a horde of brigands marching to New Orleans, but a legitimate army with a legitimate political goal. And so the slave army marched downriver. Cries of "On to New Orleans" and "Freedom or Death" echoed down the levee. They gathered strength. About a quarter of the slaves on the German coast joined in the revolt. Within a day, the rebellion had grown to a force 500 strong. As word of the insurrection spread, white planters began to flee their homes and make for the city. But not every slave owner took the threat seriously.
This is the grave of Francois Trepanier, a notoriously cruel planter.
How cruel exactly? Well, legend has it that Trepanier kept a slave boy named Gustave as a pet. He would have him on a leash and throw him dinner scraps like a dog. Now Trepanier, he scoffed when a loyal slave urged him to escape to the swamps. Instead, he sat out on his porch and grabbed his shotgun and waited for the slave army to arrive. He didn't have to wait long. Soon he saw them coming up near his front fence, so he started shooting at them. But he had a shotgun, and they were about 200 feet away, so he didn't hit a damn thing. At this point, Cook saw what was going on, went behind Trepanier's house, went up the stairs, snuck up behind him, and then he buried his axe in his skull. In New Orleans, the early morning calm was shattered by horsemen thundering through the Rue Carrée, shouting the news. Refugees poured into the city, telling horror stories of murder and mayhem. The white population began to panic.
Governor Claiborne immediately issued a 6 p.m. curfew for black men in the city, and then he did the unthinkable. He ordered that all of the bars in the city and suburbs of New Orleans be closed.
Claiborne managed to scrape together 30 regulars and 2 companies of volunteer militia, a force of 100 men against a slave army 5 times their number. Under the command of General Wade Hampton, the Americans marched to battle. Along the way, they picked up some fleeing planters, who formed an ersatz cavalry detachment. After dark, they reached the grounds of the Kenner and Henderson plantation, where the airport stands today. Here, the slave army had stopped for the night. Hampton carefully laid an ambush, positioning men around the encampment. The signal was given. The infantry and cavalry surged forward, at nothing. Minutes earlier, the slave army had retreated. The camp was almost completely abandoned.
This moment has long been regarded as a failure of military discipline on the slaves' part, but recent scholarship has revealed the wisdom of Deslondes' decision to fall back.
In his book American Uprising, academic Daniel Rasmussen has argued that the Americans had fallen for a classic West African military ruse. Congolese armies, when fighting against better armed opponents such as the Portuguese or British, often refused battle when circumstances were not in their favor. And perhaps with Cook and Kwamana advising him, Deslondes reckoned it would be better to lure the Americans into a battle he knew he could win. Given time to find good ground, the slave army could very well have destroyed the Americans, had not events across the river conspired against the rebels, and eventually brought about their doom. During the slave army's march to the city, Manuel Andry had been busy. With Charles Perret's help, he had galvanized a force of 80 plantation owners on the west bank, and on the morning of the 10th, he led them back across the river. The planter militia stumbled upon the rear of the slave army on the grounds of the Bernoudy plantation. Each side represented an existential threat to the other. If the planters won, the slaves would be slaughtered, or worse. If the slaves won, the plantation class of Louisiana would be cast down and destroyed. Each side needed to achieve victory, or they would die. African drums pounded across the field in a warlike rhythm. The planters advanced, flintlocks flashed and muzzles roared. The final battle was on.
No one knows exactly what happened next. It's possible that the slaves fired their muskets before the planters actually came within range. Or maybe the rain, which was still falling heavily that morning, obscured their vision, and a target of 500 men is much easier to hit than a target of 80 men. In any case, within minutes, the slave army was out of ammunition, and the masters were in no mood for mercy.
The slaves broke and ran. many turning north to the swamps in a desperate attempt to escape. The planters charged in and massacred every black person they could find. They only took 25 prisoners, including Cook and Quamana. Then they combed the swamps with their bloodhounds. After 2 days, the dogs found Charles Deslondes.
In revenge for his son's murder, Andrew cut off Deslondes' arms, shot him, and threw him in a fire. Cook, Quamana, and 20 other slaves were tried at a kangaroo court here at the Deslondes plantation. When Cook was asked whether he had killed Francois Trepanier with an axe, he freely and proudly admitted to the murder. And then he paid for that admission with his life.
Claiborne and the planters decided to make an example of the rebels. 100 slaves were decapitated and their heads set on pikes for 40 miles along River Road, from the Woodland Plantation all the way to the Place d'Armes in the heart of the French Quarter, what is today known as Jackson Square.
It must have been a grisly spectacle, a message from the plantation class in the only language they understood: untrammeled violence. However, the real victors here were not the French planters who had actually put down the rebellion, but American legislators who leveraged the crisis to tighten their grip on power.
A month after the revolt, Governor Claiborne wrote to Washington, asking the government to send a permanent garrison of American troops to New Orleans to protect its people and to enforce Claiborne's political will. A year later, Claiborne's dream of Louisiana statehood finally became a reality. Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 only solidified Louisiana's dependence on American military might. Though New Orleans remained ethnically French, it was now firmly an American city and would grow to be the most important port in the South, as well as the largest slave market in the United States.
For centuries, the 1811 slave revolt was relegated to a mere footnote of American history. The name of Charles Deslondes has been largely forgotten, and his deeds were deliberately portrayed as savage and rapine. Meanwhile, the names of the men who slaughtered Deslondes and oppressed his people were lionized in the place names of South Louisiana. Claiborne has a major street named after him. The town of Kenner is named after a plantation owner, as are the suburbs of Harvey, Poydras, Destrehan, Chalmette, and Mandeville, to name a few.
I could end this with flowery words about the struggle for emancipation and the triumph of civil rights. I could go on and on about how the spirit of revolution returned to America and cast down white supremacy for good. But that wouldn't really be true. And even if it were, it would be a deceptively linear interpretation of history.
The fact is, Deslondes and the rebel slaves received no justice. Not in life, and certainly not in death. They died screaming, with no assurance that one day slavery would end, or that the civil rights movement would succeed, or that in the 21st century most Americans would support racial equality. Death was the only freedom they ever got to know. The only consolation I can offer here is that all these men lived 200 years ago. White or black, slave or free, they're all equal now.